after 7:30. I think we should probably get started. Welcome to the annual Reason Fall Forum. Thank you so much for being here on this dreamy and nasty night. And I'm excited to have everybody here. We are, of course, Reason, Rationalists, Empiricists, and Skeptics of Nebraska.
I'm so sorry, it's okay.
And tonight,
Can you get closer to the microphone?
yes, I can. Thank you. The old microphone used to pick up better. Interesting. Tonight we're going to be hearing from Mr. Eric J. Weiss on Weiss. Sorry, I even practiced it. Weiss on the secret life of garbage, solid and hazardous waste in Nebraska. Mr. Weiss is currently the Environmental Assistance Coordinator for the Waste Compliance Unit in the Waste Management section of the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality. The Environmental Assistance Coordinator is tasked with conducting compliance assistance visits, providing solid and hazardous waste compliance to businesses, other government agencies, and private citizens, as well as writing and revising the solid and hazardous waste guidance documents available on the NDEQ website. So, he's the one who tells me what I have to do with the things that I generate when we do research here.
And we'll get into that.
Yes, you will. Mr. Weiss holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Geosciences with emphasis in geology and a Master of Science degree in geology with emphasis in sedimentary and paleoclimate change, both from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Mr. Weiss has worked primarily in Nebraska since his graduation, working with several consulting firms since 2005. He earned his professional geologist license from the Nebraska State Board of Geologists in 2009. After providing environmental expertise to his clients for several years, Mr. Weiss joined NDEQ in 2012. Tonight we want to thank Stu Burns for inviting Eric to come and speak with us tonight. And thank you all for being here. Oh, later. Questions? Use your mic. Things don't carry in here as well as they seem, and hold your finger down the whole time you're talking. The mic will turn green when it is active. It's a little bizarre.
So remember, if you get bored tonight, it's Stu's fault. I was trying all week to get this all ready to go for you guys, and I was reminded of a quote from Woodrow Wilson who basically said, if I need to speak for 10 minutes, I need a week to prepare. If you want me to talk for an hour, I can go now. So hi, I'm Eric. I work for the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality. My job is basically to sit in front of a phone all day and answer it in case somebody calls with a question on what to do with their solid or hazardous waste. Most of the time what I'm dealing with are private companies that they already know how to handle their material for the most part, but they hit a little bit of a hiccup. There's something that they don't usually deal with, or something that somebody brought up to their attention and they're like, okay, hang on a minute. Let's go to the source, the people who actually interpret the regulations that they wrote, and ask them how we should deal with this stuff. And then the rest of it is people who find stuff in their parents' basement. So I just got a little outline for you here today. First thing I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of a history on solid waste in general and solid waste regulations in Nebraska, how things work. We're going to talk about landfills and other facilities a little bit. We're going to get into the hazardous waste side of things and kind of explain how that all gets handled in Nebraska and what makes that different than solid waste. And then finally, we're going to look at some real-world problem solving associated with those regulations and how we at the agency deal with that kind of stuff on a daily basis, or, well, actually, an example I'm going to give you on, we hope it's a never happens basis, but it does happen often in this state. So, first of all, a brief history of trash. We as a species are pretty unique, more or less, in that we are very good at congregating our garbage, where all of our waste materials, we tend to put it all in a pile somewhere. This is obviously good for us for hygiene reasons, but it also kind of keeps our living space a little bit clearer. This is a kind of a fuzzy picture of an oyster mitten This is probably Native American in origin on the East Coast there. You basically start hauling them out of the bay, and once you shuck them, you got to have some place to put the shells. And so we see this kind of stuff all over the place. You know, we have archaeologists who will just drool at the chance of digging up an old junk pile from any old place. But most of the time what we see is people digging around in old privy pits. These are a couple of pits that they actually had in New Jersey. Obviously this guy's having a lot of fun down there. If you've ever actually found or seen one of these old privy pits, they look at first like a very well constructed well, like a brick well. You look at them and you're like, wow, that must have been where somebody got their water. No, it wasn't. Obviously, we also at the time, we're talking about the 16, 17, 1800s, even up into the 1900s, we really just didn't have a lot of sanitary services unless you were in a really big city and they really just had to, otherwise the streets would have been full. So what you see a lot of the time is anything that was broken, anything that wasn't being used anymore, anything that wasn't wanted anymore, put it down to the privy hole, essentially. And so after a while, you know, they would eventually fill in, and you know, they would move over and build another one. And generally speaking, you just kind of forget it was there, or you know, hopefully nobody ever finds what you put in there. But as you can see, a lot of times we do find a lot of useful information about how people lived, if we can date the time period that came from. Obviously, as we get into like the 1800s and later, a lot of the glass objects, the bottles and the containers, they'll actually have a date stamped on them, or at least a year. And that can kind of give us a little bit of a sedimentary layer, and we can figure out exactly what we're looking at. So, landfills in the United States, really, I mean, prior to 1900, most of the time, if anything, it was just a big hole that somebody dug on the outskirts of town, something that was, at least we hope, most of the time downwind. Though, even then, a lot of the times we weren't looking at a lot of putrescible waste going into landfills. For the most part, people were, you know, living in the 17 and 1800s had a mentality a lot like some of the people today who go out of their way to do a lot of their kitchen composting and other things. They could make useful stuff for the garden and for their property by basically recycling their own garbage. And so it's the stuff that went out to the actual dump was the larger materials, broken furniture, you know, bottles and cans and all sorts of things that you really couldn't find another use for. And generally speaking, it didn't have a lot of organic matter in it either. You did have some newspapers, but for the most part, paper was such a commodity that nobody ever threw a book away unless they absolutely had to. So you're still looking at mostly wood waste, ceramic waste, glass waste, that kind of stuff. And we move forward into the 20th century, and what we would call the first modern landfill is actually in Fresno, California, in 1937. They started doing the things that we kind of take for granted today. They had daily cover that they would put out over the garbage at the end of the day. They would use compactors, heavy equipment, to go out and crush the waste down to try to make as thin a layer as possible when they put this stuff out. And a lot of the ideas that were utilized in that landfill have been carried forward. We use them in almost every landfill in the United States today. In fact, the landfill at Fresno is now a historic landmark. So we move forward, we get the Solid Waste Disposal Act came out in 1965. This was actually a federal mandate to try to push into play a lot of the stuff that they had already figured out in Fresno. And it, you know, it actually took over quite well, because anybody who was running a landfill, the practices that were put into place in Fresno would drastically increase the life of your landfill. You're basically compacting it down, making more room for more waste later. Obviously, the big one for everything we're going to be talking about today is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. That came about in 1976. Call it a wave of nationalism with our bicentennial, that they were pushed through a lot of the regulations that are still in place today. In fact, most of RCRA has not really changed that much in the last 40 years now. And we're still figuring some stuff out. We just this year we had a new rule on the definition of solid waste, which you would think, well, just go look in the Webster's, but I mean, there's a sheaf of paperwork on my desk that I fall asleep every time I try to read through it, but that's like the definite, I don't know how many lawyers wrote that thing, but it's a sleep aid if you want to go into there. But it defines what solid waste is in Nebraska, because there's a lot, or in the United States, because there's a lot of companies, a lot of people who would like to say that the byproduct of their industry isn't actually a waste, that it's another commodity that they haven't figured out how to sell yet. So moving on, we got some little bit more of additional criteria in 1979, not too much to talk about there. But the big one that we're going to talk about in the next couple slides here is Subtitle D. Subtitle D came about in 1993, October 9th. This is when every local junkyard, every local dump, that's when every farmer, every small community in Nebraska, everybody had to have their landfill closed, or if it wasn't closed by October 9th, they had to put into place all of the new regulations, which basically required structures to be put in place, how to build a landfill, how to monitor a landfill, how to take care of your garbage. So the first thing it did is put in a location restrictions. Now we're worried about drainage. We're worried about the proximity to streams and rivers and lakes. We're worried about the environmental impact of this, not just to water, but also to air. We're also looking at the critical environments for some endangered species already at that time. And then the big one here is the liner requirements. Something that was never required before, but is absolutely required now, is that every landfill that is in use in the United States today has to have an impermeable barrier on the bottom so that nothing can leak out of it. And speaking of leaking, we also have leachate collection. Leachate is the mostly water, but it's the liquid component that drains down through the landfill like a giant coffee filter and collects at the bottom. And what they'll actually have piping in place to suck that material out, put it into their leachate pond. Depending on where you are in the United States, if your evaporation level is high enough, pretty much everything this side of Des Moines, you can usually get away with just having a large leachate pond, and eventually the water will evaporate away, and most of the rest of the salts and other minerals and whatnot get left behind, and those can be processed at a later date. If you're on the East Coast, however, you usually have to have that stuff pumped off to a water treatment plant, because you'll never dry up. There will always be more water than you can deal with. Some landfills actually have that stuff piped so that they can recirculate it back into the top of the landfill. Since we are dealing with materials that do biodegrade over time, especially now that people are starting to do gas collection for power generation, that leachate is a liquid component. It will activate and enhance any bacterial action that's going on inside that trash mound and give it a little boost. So some people will recirculate that material. And then obviously it also has requirements for operations, the top cover that you have to put over the landfill when you're done, the daily cover that you have to put on top of your waste when you're done compacting it, litter control of the area, the soil that you put out there. Actually, bystander to that is the odor control. If you cover it up every night, it doesn't smell as bad, oddly enough. And then we also have to make sure that you're not letting any of that material out into the environment. You know, we do have that liner requirement, the impermeable barrier that goes underneath the landfill, but you need to have groundwater monitoring, not only inside the landfill, but outside of it, so you can see what the background groundwater is like. You can see if anything's escaping from your landfill, keep track of any of the chemicals that might be released, and then obviously work to remediate that if you do have a breach. Some of the rest of the stuff is mostly for bankers and lawyers, but we have corrective action and financial assurance. You're basically saying this is what you will do if you have a problem, and this financial assurance is kind of an insurance policy that you put out on your landfill. You have to pay in so much every year, and the whole idea is if there were a catastrophic problem, or God forbid you went bankrupt or left the country or whatever, we would still have something in place monetarily to take care of that landfill and make sure that we can close it out safely and encapsulate that waste so it doesn't get into the environment. Which leads into closure and post-closure. We haven't really gotten there yet, where 1993 was when this started. We didn't have very many that closed right after '93. Most of them were before, so they got grandfathered out of this. But once a landfill closes, it goes into something called post-closure. It takes 30 years for a landfill to actually close after the last load of garbage goes in. And they monitor the air, they monitor the water, they check to make sure you're not getting sinkholes from disproportionate disintegration of material, that kind of thing. And basically that financial assurance is in play to finance the post-closure of that landfill after the business is ended. So, prescriptive liners, it starts off with a compacted bed of clay. We're going to look for naturally occurring material if we can get a hold of it, but we want several feet of that. We want it to have as low a permeability as possible. Now that is not actually the layer that's going to keep any of the liquids in, but that's just kind of like an extra insurance underneath the liner. Then we have this bonded liner. The entire thing is like, if you can imagine, you know, those backyard swimming, just a big piece of plastic that you fill up. Imagine one of those that you can put, I don't know, 8 or 9 football fields in the bottom, and you can't have even a single pinprick in it. You have to be completely and totally impermeable. The standard is the high-density polyethylene, which is HDPE. We ask for at least a 60 mil layer of that. We have some people who have been using a PVC layer. They only need about 30 mils of that. On top of that, we have a geonet or geotextile. It's basically, it almost looks like netting or thickly woven wool and burlap fabric kind of thing. It's basically gives strength to the layers of sediment and material that you're putting on there so that it doesn't shift or break through, but it also has a total permeability so that anything can go through there. And then mixed in with that, you have all the pipe work and everything else that is the leachate collection system. And then obviously you have a protective sanded gravel layer over this whole thing that you don't have direct contact between your impermeable layers and the garbage that's going to go into that landfill. So this is a nice little cross-section, just to give you an idea here. This is just kind of idealized. We have a whole row of engineers that I sit next to, and every time somebody wants to do a landfill, they gotta come in and they give you a huge stack of paperwork that basically says, here is the operator's manual for our landfill. Is this okay? And so our engineers will go through it piece by piece and say, okay, well, you should probably put this layer below this layer, or you need to have a thicker mill material if you want to put that there. And so they'll work their way through, and most of the time, especially out here in Nebraska, we don't have very shallow groundwater unless you're out on a flat valley someplace. Most of our landfills, actually, they'll be dug down as deep below the surface as they eventually stick out above the surface. And so what you're essentially doing is you're digging it out, you're putting a big berm around it to stabilize, and then you've gotten permission to have a landfill there. You are selling airspace, and you are only allowed to go so high. The engineering specs say if you go over a certain amount, you may destabilize and the whole thing can slough off like a landslide, so they only let you get so high above the ground surface. And then if you want to imagine daily as they come out here, I don't know if any of you, has anybody ever actually been to a landfill that's in operation? So a few people. So they go out and they dump everything that they're going to have. Everybody comes out with their garbage trucks or whatever, they dump it out for the day. They have compactors, big heavy equipment that rolls over it, kind of crushes everything down, bulldozers, end loaders, and everything else. And the whole idea is they kind of spread this all out over the working face, and then at the end of the day, in Nebraska at least, you have to put 6 inches of soil over the top of that to kind of cover it up. And so if you want to imagine of a large scale idea, just try to think of filling a swimming pool with pancakes. And every pancake is 1 day of garbage, and you have to make sure there's a layer of stuff between each pancake so they don't actually touch or come into contact with each other. And eventually you'll get high enough that you can't put any more pancakes in because they'll slough out the side of the swimming pool. So that's, you know, some of our landfills have been going for 40 or 50 years now. Some of them may be going, I know Sarpy County is actually probably going to close at the end of this year. And then that's it. They're not going to be able to put any more waste in that landfill, and they're going to be trucking that material around. Pheasant Point out here, I think it's probably got another couple of decades to go. As they come up with new technology, they'll keep rolling.
Where is Pheasant Point?
Pheasant Point it's north of town here in Omaha. I don't know if I can find it. It's in Douglas County, but if you think about Douglas County as a big like rectangle, it's kind of up in the northwestern corner a little bit.
Was it the successor to 126th State? Was the previous landfill before Pheasant Point 126th and State Street?
I think there was one out there. What you have to understand is before Subtitle D went into effect, we had arguably thousands of landfills in Nebraska. At this point, right now, we have less than 60. In fact, I think we have less than 40 that are permitted in the state. We kind of have a running joke. If you buy a piece of land, especially farmland in Nebraska, whether you know it or not, you're also buying an old landfill. Because everybody had their own dump out back door. But I know there was one out there on 128th Street that was active for some time. Obviously, the city has overcome that at that point. And that's part of the location requirements. Nobody wants to have a landfill in the middle of town, unless you're Gering, apparently. Has anybody ever been to Gering? We have a problem with Gering right now. We don't have a problem. We're fine with it. We already permitted their landfill. But somebody had the bright idea to put a whole bunch of very high-end tract housing literally across the street to the east of this landfill. And so now you have all these bankers and car salesmen and whatever else calling us to complain, A, about the odor of the landfill that literally was there 20 years before their house was built, and 2, they can't see the Scotts Bluff Memorial out their picture window because now there's this giant hill of garbage in the way. And that's not my fault. I'm sorry, I can't help you. It would literally be like, here's the Scotts Bluff Memorial, or monument, here's the landfill, that's the guy's house. I mean, you could literally throw a baseball and hit the junk with it. And I don't know why they thought that would be a good idea, because they didn't even build that until at least a couple decades after the landfill was in play. But I digress. So, as you can see also here, we've got the monitoring wells that are out. Some of them actually run down the inside of the landfill, so you can monitor how the trash is going. We have a lot of air regulations that have been in place, and a lot more that are going into place this next year. There's been a lot of talk about emission standards as far as CO2 and especially methane. Methane, depending on who you talk to, is 14 to 18 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as CO2. And then you're dealing with not only the livestock industry, but now all of our landfills and everything else. So the whole idea, even if you burn it and turn it into CO2, that's better than just letting the methane free. So we are seeing more and more landfills, in fact, pretty soon in Nebraska, being required for almost all of them, that will have this gas collection and monitoring system in place in the working face and in the older parts of the landfill, the older cells that aren't being used anymore. And they're collecting that material, and some of them are cleaning it up and pushing it into the pipeline and getting a little bit of bucks back from that. Some of them are actually burning it on site and creating the electricity that the landfill uses. And for example, in Lincoln, we're a little bit in the hole right now because the price of energy went way down, but they've got a system out there. If you've ever driven by on the interstate, they've got a couple of big wind turbines out there on the north side of the interstate. And they're actually collecting the gas from the Lincoln landfill, and they're powering several very large cat generators, the things that are about the size of a car. And they're pumping out energy into the LES grid down there. So, but we're seeing that a lot more and more. I think that's going to be, we're already seeing now landfill improvements and landfill additions that are using the expected profit from utilizing that natural gas as an offset, not only for their financial insurance, but also their operating costs.
I have a question with regard to private landfill type things like that farmers do when they burn down a building or want to bury some in Nebraska? Because my experience in another state has been that you hire a D9 cat to come in, dig a big hole, and just bury it.
Well, as for actually operating a landfill, since 1993, that is no longer allowed by anybody. There are no more private landfills. We still get farmers who have their own burn barrel, and they'll get a burn permit from their local constabulary or whatever. Their fire, usually local volunteer fire chief, will be in charge of the burn permits and whatnot, and they'll still do that. But as far as actually operating a dump on the property, they are not allowed to do that since 1993. However, we do have, obviously we're an agricultural state, so we have a lot of exemptions to a lot of our rules, and it just so happens that a lot of those exemptions are allowable for farmers. So if you are on agriculturally zoned land and you have a building that you want to demolish, there's several ways you can go about doing it. Usually if you're inside city limits, you basically have to knock the thing down and haul the whole thing away. First of all, you have to do an asbestos check. Everybody, no matter where you are, you have to do an asbestos check. It has to be from a licensed or a permitted inspector. If you have asbestos on the site, you also have to have a state licensed abatement contractor come in and take care of that material. Most of the people will then strip the whole thing out, take out all the copper and metal piping and anything else that they can salvage and sell to a scrapper. And then most of those houses are primarily wood and whatever, and they just basically push them into their own foundation and haul them off either to a construction and demolition landfill or the MSW landfills that we've been talking about here, municipal solid waste landfills. But if you're on a farm, you can legally push a whole building into a hole and bury it. And you don't have to worry about it. You still have to do your asbestos check. You still have to empty the building. It can't just be full of garbage and furniture and whatever else. It has to be just an empty structure. But you are allowed to push it into a hole on that property and bury it. And we do allow that a little bit in town, but generally speaking what happens is they take the surface structure away, and then the foundation, if it's brick and concrete. The brick and concrete is basically the same as rock. We would consider it to be equivalent to regular fill, and so that can be pushed into a hole on that piece of property. But you can't have any biodegradable material, you can't have any wood or plastic or anything else like that inside city limits. That's all got to be taken away. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I also have a question about, you said that methane has to be cleaned up before it's put into a pipeline?
Yeah, it's very wet. It has a very high, it's moist. It's very humid material, if that makes any sense. They have to actually strip all of the water out of it. There will be some other gases in there every once in a while that are just byproducts of bacteriological action. It's usually mostly methane, but they do have to, like I said, they basically put it through like some carbon filters and do some other things to, oddly enough, clean up this landfill fart so that you can put it into a pipeline and sell it.
Follow-on question on that. Is there a danger of some sophisticated chemical going into the landfill that gets somehow into the methane stream?
It's possible. I won't say it doesn't happen, but so far it hasn't happened. We do allow, there's a lot of exemptions for what we call household hazardous waste and small business waste. Conditionally exempt small businesses who produce less than a certain amount a month, they can also take most of their hazardous waste to a landfill. The trick there is that most of the materials that I think you're worried about, generally speaking, are either a liquid or gaseous material to begin with. And the gaseous material is probably never going to make it to the landfill because just the container it has to be in. And liquid material is not allowed in the landfill. All of our landfills have to pass a paint filter test, which is basically you take a representative sample of the material that you want to take to the landfill, and you basically, it looks like a cold brew coffee filter, where you just have a big glass funnel and a coffee filter, and you put a sample in and you time it, and if it drips even once, it can't go in the landfill. So we're trying to get dry material, and I say that, but we also have several landfills that practice bulking, where they will have a facility on site where they will take your wet waste and they will mix it with dry auto fluff or silage or soil or whatever they've got to soak up the liquid until it will pass a paint filter test, and then they charge you for the tonnage of everything they mixed in. So it's a good job.
I have a question here too. I thought we couldn't put, what do you call it, lawn waste into the landfill anymore. And if,
I'll get to that. We can't. There's from April 1st until November 30th of every year, there's a yard waste ban at every landfill in Nebraska, unless the landfill itself has asked for an exemption. We do have a couple of them that either don't have an active composting plan in progress or they don't have a diversionary structure in place, but more often it's because they want that extra organic matter in the landfill so they can make more methane.
so that's that if you close down your compost plan because you screw up on your contracts, you can get exemption.
You do have to, well, remember what I said when they're coming in and they're basically saying, here's the operations manual for our landfill? And it is literally like a how to run this landfill. They will have everything lined out at exactly what they want to do. Every time they change that document, doesn't matter what it is, even if they just have a grammatical mistake that they change, they have to pay to get a minor modification to that, and an engineer has to look at it all over again. If they change anything that has to do with the actual engineered structure or how the landfill will look or operate, that's probably a major modification, and that's many thousands of dollars just to submit the application to DEQ, because it takes our engineers. On some of these permits, it'll take an engineer 2 or 3 weeks full-time to go through the whole thing and make sure all the numbers are right, make sure all the specs are correct, and everything else. And that's a little bit of the offset to try to make sure that we're covering that person's time to basically check your paperwork. But some of them have put in, we have, forget what the term is, it's basically an experimental mod to the permit. We're saying, okay, we're not going to use 6 inches of daily cover. We've got this stuff that's actually a mixture of like sawdust and latex paint, and it only needs to be this thick, but it covers everything as well as soil does. We would like to use this alternative daily cover instead. What do you think? And we'll say, okay, well, you could do this for 18 months or 3 years or however long this test will take. And do that. I know, for example, Sarpy County landfill was using a latex-based alternative daily cover. And now that they're going to close down the landfill and they no longer need that, places like Under the Sink and other organizations are trying to figure out what they're going to do with their excess latex paint because nobody's going to buy it from them anymore. So it's all a big circle that kind of, a little dragon that eats its own tail in a little bit of a way. But there are some of these places that are saying, hey, we're starting to see major developments of methane. We're actually really planning on doing a lot of power production from this methane, and we're also cleaning that methane up to sell it to basically help the landfill stay solvent. And part of that argument is saying, hey, we need more organic content in our working phase, in our daily traffic, and so they will get an exemption to put some of that yard waste in with their daily loads to keep up that organic content.
Doesn't federal law say that any,
Use the mic.
oh,
Hold it down.
doesn't federal law say that any waste dump on your land is kind of your responsibility?
It is actually. That's why we have a number of investigators. When they're not out doing actual hazardous waste investigation, they're often following up on complaints, and a lot of those are dumping complaints. If there is a dump happening in a ditch within so many feet of the right-of-way, there are grants in place so that the county or city can actually get reimbursed to clean that up themselves. But if it is on a private landowner's land, you're kind of stuck with it. It's now your problem because it was on your property. So we do work a lot with law enforcement. We do have a lot of people who have even had problems in the past, and they'll put up game trail cameras and other things to try to catch people in the act. And hopefully, most of the time, it's just, you know, yard waste or you know, somebody's got a couple pallets or something that's not that bad. But every once in a while, you'll go out and a guy will just say, there is, you know, literally almost like a comic barrel of stuff bubbling in this field. I don't know where this came from. And you have to come and show up, and you have to figure out what's in there, first of all, because nobody's going to touch it until they know what they have to get rid of. And then there's a whole swath of problems that happen there. If you don't know who did it, you as a landowner might be stuck with the bill.
Well, along those lines, doesn't that apply if you buy an acreage and someone had a dump on that land that you're now, as the landowner, you're now responsible for?
Are you speaking of more recent deposits or like before 1993?
Before 1993.
Anything that was, any landfill, any dump, anything else that was closed down and covered over in the prescribed way before 1993 is basically grandfathered in. The only time that you would need to clean it up is if you literally didn't know it was there and you uncovered it. And even then, you only have to dispose of the stuff you remove from the ground because we consider that newly generated waste. Anything that's still down there, you can rebury and put a flag in it, you know. Don't dig here.
That's weird, but so is making somebody responsible for it if they discover it on their property later.
Well, and we do have, it is, even in an unlined landfill, it is surprising how long some of this waste survives. And so, you know, they'll go out and they'll pop, you know, they'll get an auger rig to go out and pop one of these vertical gas wells in, and they'll bring up that hot dog literally looks like it was thrown in there yesterday, but it's wrapped in a newspaper from the 50s. You know, it is, that stuff stays there a long time. And that's also why they're talking about doing that recirculation of the leachate, getting that water. Some people are actually asking to put more liquid waste in because that adds to that methane production, and that bacteria will actually break down a lot of that organic matter a lot faster. And then, you know, you get to the nth degree of that iteration, and you've got guys who say, I don't need to be in post-closure for 30 years because everything's completely inert after 10. And they'll try to get out of their post-closure requirements because everything is stabilized. And some of them have a legitimate argument for that. Unfortunately, out here in Nebraska, like I said, we're kind of on the dry side of things, so most of our landfills tend to be like a dry tune kind of idea. So they really have to like pump liquids in there to get this activity to happen. Most of the time, it will literally just be there forever. It will never biodegrade unless there's some sort of water in contact with it. All right, well, we're burning time. Okay, so MSW versus CND, all of your garbage that you get from your kitchen, that is going to a municipal solid waste landfill. That's Pheasant Point, that's Sarpy County. That is the lined landfill. That is has to pass the paint filter test like we talked about. We also have construction and demolition landfills. These are basically, no liner is required on these because you're not going to have any putrescible waste in there. It's all going to be wood, shingles, pallets. You know, it's basically material from construction and demolition. It's stuff that's not expected to biodegrade in any great amount over time, and it's not supposed to have any questionable material in it. We'll get into this later, but a municipal solid waste landfill, there's quite a lot of hazardous waste that's actually in an MSW landfill because so many people are exempted from hazardous waste regulations that they can literally just throw it in a dumpster and it's completely legal. And we would much rather it goes into a lined landfill where we know where it is than them not disposing of it correctly and then we find it in some guy's field later. So we have a couple other different things we do. The materials recovery facility, this is something that's really starting to catch on. It's been going on the coasts for a while now. It's starting to crank up here in Nebraska. Basically, your waste is being sorted either by hand or mechanically before it goes to the landfill. How many Omaha residents, most of you? You have your big green tub? That's all going to a MRF right now. They're going to go through, that's why you don't have to separate your recyclables because they have a giant machine that does it for them. It's also why they don't want any glass because they want to avoid the liability of somebody getting cut by glass and everything else that's in there. So, their focus is usually on marketable materials. We do permit them, but that's because they have an outflow, or a true recycling facility, less than 10% of the material that comes in is going to go to the landfill, and so we're going to give them an exemption. They don't need to be permitted. But anybody who goes over that 10%, it's, you know, some of them are 15, 20, 30% of that material. There's just no marketable value for it. You've got to send it on to the landfill. So we got permits required for that. Here's a kind of a diagram here, if you can kind of watch. They basically dump the stuff in. They've got a number of different conveyor belts. They've got vacuums. They've got air curtains. They've got huge rotating magnets that pull in all of the ferrous metals and whatnot. They've got hammer mills that then go through and obliterate what's left. And then, you know, they think, well, why don't you pick out the whole plastic bottle that you know, so you can, you know, just put that in a big bale with other plastic bottles. Well, if you look at the way the plastics and the glass and all these different things are, they're all different density, they're all slightly different weight. So if you can knock them all into pieces no bigger than $0.50, then you can more efficiently sort all of that without a human ever having to lay finger on it. It's all mechanical. And we do actually have one here in Omaha. This is the Omaha MRF. This is where all your green bin waste goes through eventually. Obviously a lot of paper. They have a huge baler, essentially. They push all this stuff in, and this stuff comes out. You got to have a forklift to move it. They're usually about 1 meter square or so, weigh a couple 100 pounds, if not 1,000 pounds of just pure paper or pure plastic or pure aluminum cans, and they're all just one big block, and I'll stack them up. These are actually bins. I don't think, actually, you can see back here. You can see these squares back here. These are baled up paper. And so what they'll have is the people who are buying recycles, if you ever look at your paper towels or whatever, and it says this is 70% post-consumer waste, that's what they're doing, is they're buying that recycled paper pulp, and they're pulping it up and they're adding it into their system. And so they're 70% of what they're putting in there is recycled material that they're buying from a MRF or some other recycling facility. Transfer stations, this is what Sarpy County is going to turn into at the end of this year. Basically, it's a giant dump site. It's got a place for all of your garbage trucks to dump. Garbage trucks don't get good gas mileage, oddly enough. Call me crazy, but I don't know why. Well, what they'll do is they'll basically have a large pit or other structure that they can dump their materials into, and they'll have a number of loaders or front-end loaders or bulldozers or whatever, and then push that garbage into a long tractor trailer, and then that gets, they'll cover that up, make sure it's sealed, and then they'll drive that. In some cases, they're driving an hour and a half, 2 hours to the closest landfill that will accommodate them. The tipping fee and the price of diesel is going to vastly affect how far they're willing to travel. And so they'll often kind of query all of the landfills around a transfer station to see who's going to be the cheapest one to take it to. And so this is from San Francisco. As you can see, these guys, they back right up to the edge, they dump out, and then as soon as they dump, they can go right back out and collect more garbage. They don't have to worry about transporting that material all the way to the landfill. So you'll find that the transfer station is usually centrally located in a service area. So that's the quickest place. They just go, dump, go back into the neighborhood and start picking more stuff up. And so tipping fee is something we should talk about. Tipping fee is what happens when you take anything to a landfill. This is your cost per ton to dump stuff in that landfill. Transfer stations usually have it as well. Transfer stations more often than not are associated with a landfill as a business. So one or the other of them will collect the tipping fee. We don't care who collects the tipping fee, we just want our $1.25 a ton. That's how DEQ waste section actually gets most of our operating budget, is we have $1.25 per ton that we charge. In Nebraska, most of our landfills are about $25, $30 a ton for tipping fee. And that's actually led to some problems. We have a unique problem that the coasts don't have, in that we have got a lot of real estate and it's really cheap to throw something away. And it's because of that it is almost impossible for a recycling business to become solvent in Nebraska. They can't sell what they're recycling for enough to cover the fee and still be less expensive than a tipping fee at a landfill. You know, if I'm going to take this to the landfill, it's going to cost me $30, but this recycler wants $32 a ton for the same material. It's not a no-brainer. But you go out to some place like New Jersey, and we've got landfills that are probably within the next year or so, they're going to exceed $200 a ton to dump out there. And so you go out, you know, we got that. We also have parts of Europe where we're up in the high hundreds to $200 a ton. And so that's where you're seeing everybody does kitchen composting. Everybody does total recycling of all cardboard, paper, wood, glass, metal, anything you can think of. The only thing that goes to the landfill is something that is literally so filthy with stuff that you don't want to touch it, or it just cannot be recycled at all. They want to break that down and get it as little as possible actually going to the landfill because it's cheaper. But until such time as our tipping fees in Nebraska go up, it's cheaper to just throw it away. And it's just been the way it is for a while now. I was on a conference call with a couple of guys last week, and we're all around the country, and they're like, why don't you guys have any recycling programs in Nebraska? I'm like, how much does it cost you to throw away garbage? And they told me, and I'm like, how much do you think it cost me to throw it away? I told them, and they didn't believe me. They literally did not believe me. They're like, that's impossible. That you can't even drive it there for that amount. I'm like, that's what it is. Sorry. So composting.
Excuse me, before you move on, in the transfer stations, what about the fire hazard? I've seen smoking garbage trucks going down the road with it.
That's called a hot load. And regardless of what everybody says, everybody gets a hot load at least once a year. Some of them get a couple hot loads in a week, especially during barbecue season. Let's just say if you're going to dump your coals, make sure that they're actually out. I don't think that there's a landfill in this country that has not had some sort of a hot load fire at some point. Whether it's in the working phase or in the transfer station, I think we've actually had a transfer station completely burn out before and then rebuild the thing. It just happens. They do have as part of their operating procedure, you're supposed to do spot checks of loads, you're supposed to be on the eyeball for this, but you know, half the time the guy running the garbage truck literally does not know his truck is on fire until it stops and somebody's pointing and waving at it. They're just blinders on, I gotta get to the transfer station, I gotta dump, and I gotta get more. And I mean, really, that's gotta be pretty cool going down the highway and you see this flaming garbage truck. I mean, that's gotta be, that'd be pretty, I'd put that on my, road bingo sheet right there. So, it does happen. Obviously, we don't want it to happen. And there's a lot of, every time somebody's got a garbage service or whatever, notice the little pamphlet that'll say, don't put hot coals or whatever in it. They'll have the little warnings and things in there, but accidents happen and people aren't paying attention. So I would say pretty much every landfill and every transfer station in the state, I would say at least once a year gets a hot load. Most of the time they're smart enough to keep it outside and hose it down, and that's not a big deal, but every once in a while one gets in there. And there are landfill fires around the country that some of them are still burning. They just get down in there and they're just like a coal fire. You can't put them out. So there's one in Missouri right now that's down in an old quarry, and the whole thing is starting to kind of sink in on itself because everything is like burned out about 100 feet down and they don't know what to do with it. But did that answer your question? Okay. So composting, yard waste, like I said, April 1st through November 30th. That ban was put into place to promote the composting of that material. It also saves on landfill space. If you've got a landfill, you are literally selling airspace. That is what you're doing with your material. The more you can compact it, the more you can sell. And if you can divert a whole swath of waste out of your landfill, you've just extended the landfill for that much longer. So if that was 30% of your waste in a year and you got rid of it, you've now added 3 out of every 10 years to your landfill that you didn't have before. So they'll do that a lot. Well, like I said, there are exceptions to every rule. Some want to get that yard waste in there for methane production. But I know Lincoln and I think Omaha as well, they do have composting. Omagrow, is Omagrow still putting out free compost?
No, it went by the wayside with this change over there.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. It didn't happen on the other side of 120th Street, so who cares? But I digress. I was 3 years in Omaha until I moved back to Lincoln last year. So I just got into the trend of hating the mayor, and then I had to move. So
Don't worry about it, you will like one.
okay. Well, I hope not. So Lincoln, I know at least still does composting. depending on where you are, I think Grand Island's got composting on site, Kearney's got composting on site, I think Columbus has got composting on site. A lot of people would actually do composting on the same site that they have a C&D landfill instead of the MSW landfill if they can, because that's the same kind of waste. A lot of people think, you know, pallets and shingles and whatever I got out of the yard, you know, shrubs and trees and grass clippings, all goes to the same place. And so what you'll see is there'll be big piles of grass, and they'll have these big machines that turn it over and make nice compost with it, and maybe once every 6 months or 8 months, they'll have somebody come out with a big tub grinder, throw all the old stumps and the logs and whatever in there to make nice wood chips, and sometimes you can get the wood chips directly, and a lot of times they'll take those wood chips and they'll use that as a carbon source to kind of make the grass clippings compost better, and just try to make a useful product that, like I said, back in the 1800s, you were doing that yourself. You wanted that compost for your own garden. You certainly didn't give it to somebody else and then pay them for it later. So, but we do not permit compost sites unless you're doing a lot of compost, like 100,000 cubic yards, or if you do over 1,000 yards of food waste, because that smells and everybody complains, and we don't like to deal with that. So, we have right now, I think, the Prairie Land Dairy south of Lincoln gets a lot of the compostable plates and forks and all the stuff from Memorial Stadium. They have to use special materials, special plastics that are compostable, and then they make a food waste compost out there. And there are so many rules because you can't have that crossover with stuff where you have livestock on the same site, and there's all these ag rules that they have to keep with. And then everybody and their dog calls us up when the wind changes and goes, I can't go outside, it smells like, you know. So, lots of fun. There's not a regulation anywhere on the books in Nebraska about odor, but that is the #1 thing we get the complaints about. Does anybody know what this is? We're going to shift gears. This is the Cuyahoga River. This is actually from the spread in 1969 in Time Magazine, talking about the Cuyahoga lighting on fire for the 13th time, I think. Oddly enough, this picture that they put in here and the other ones, this is actually from the 1952 fire. Did $1.5 million worth of damage in 1952 to boats and infrastructure along the river. As they joked, it's the river that oozes, it does not flow. This is the 69 fire was one of the things that prompted RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act. We talked about that. They came on board, came online in 1976. Basically, just response to increasing problems with the industrial pollution. We had the Cuyahoga River. We had Love Canal came about right about the same time, 1970s into the early 80s. Just industrial pollution at a level, you know, World War II, we cranked it up, and we didn't have any infrastructure damage from the war, and we just kept cranking it out for the next couple decades. And the thing was, the cheapest way to get rid of your waste, to make the highest profit, was probably the least safe for anybody who was anywhere near it. And so, without any regulation to make them take care of their waste, they would literally dump it in the school ground if they could get away with it. So that's RCRA came about, mandated primarily the protection of human health and the environment. And that's still one of the mandates if I go to a compliance assistance visit, which is a business will ask me to show up and take a look at how they're handling their hazardous waste, and I kind of give them pointers. I say, we need to fix that, and this isn't right. You get all this stuff fixed, by the time you actually get inspected, you should get a clean bill of health. And that's why I'm a compliance assistant and not an inspector.
Are there any local Superfund areas?
We do have some Superfund sites in Nebraska. We have a whole section of the waste section that's just remediation. All they do, actually most of what they're doing right now is old tank, underground storage tanks. They'll go back, you know, all this stuff was exempted when you dug it out, but all of a sudden 20 years later you find this plume of material that's running away from the old Phillips station, and you got to figure out where it came from and whose responsibility it really is to clean up, and if nobody's left, then it goes into Superfund. And Superfund is the fund, ideally, that all of the industries are paying into, so that if you find a problem that there is nobody legally responsible for, because they're either all defunct or dead or bankrupt, they can take money out of Superfund and clean it up.
Yeah, I don't know if your expertise extends across state lines, but I believe the AX Chemical, Lorenz Chemical site just across the Mills County line by the interstate was a Superfund site. Is that still an issue? Or is it-
I'm not certain if it still is. I mean, generally speaking, a Superfund site takes a long time to clean up. I think the average cleanup time is about 30 years. I actually one of my first jobs, I was working with a gentleman from the Army Corps of Engineers who was distinguished in that he was the first person to live through an entire cleanup project. So,
Looks like the Memphis Belle finally gets to send its crew home.
yeah. So, but if I show up on site and you have a burning dumpster in the middle of your building, I'll tell you to stop doing that because that's a danger to human health.
So this is going to be kind of an odd question, but
I love odd questions.
okay. So you mentioned earlier about, you know, Daly's dump of garbage in a landfill, then that gets covered with soil or whatever, and then the next day goes on top of that, kind of like the pancake analogy that you used.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever had an instance where the police have had to go to a landfill to look for evidence or a body, and they have to go down several days worth of
Yes,
garbage?
and it's not my problem.
So do they have to shut down the landfill when that happens? And
Generally speaking, they'll have kind of a, they don't really map out where everything is. You basically just ask the guys who are working there, like, where was the working face last Thursday? And they say, well, I think it was about over here. And you start digging. You rarely see that kind of activity. I mean, if you can imagine the amount of material that is generated by a city, like the city of Omaha in one day. And there is trash pickup, I think 6 days a week here in town, if I'm not mistaken. And when you're talking about thousands of cubic yards of material, it is literally a needle in a haystack. You just would not be able to find it. However, they do have, there's like stages. Sometimes they'll say, okay, well, this transfer station has yesterday's garbage in it, but it hasn't been taken to the landfill yet. Maybe we can isolate that because we know this garbage came to that area. We also know this business is probably the dumpster that was used. Let's see if they still have the dumpster, that kind of thing. Obviously, the bigger the town, the less likely you're going to see that kind of thing happen. The smaller the town, you can kind of get away with it. Sometimes we'll go out and find these guys that dump stuff, and they're stupid enough to leave their mail in the bag. And you just go, all right, Stu Burns. What's not here? This is not you, is it? Or, hey, this, you guys know that your landfill was supposed to be closed in 1993, and yet we see this open pile of crap in your ditch out back. Oh, no, that's from 93. The storm just washed it open. Really? Because this is last week's electric bill.
So when they're done, I assume they have to cover everything back up again?
Yep, you gotta cover everything back up again. I mean, and you know, we say it's daily cover.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be daily cover, but you can't be perfect. I mean, I know like we get inclement weather and stuff like this. You can't always get your daily cover on. It's not always exactly 6 inches thick. You know, so if a police officer feels the need to go out and dig through a pile of garbage, you know, he can have fun with that. We'll worry about it after we get done with tomorrow's batch, and we'll cover the whole thing up. So, not that big of a problem for us at least, or for the landfill, but I mean, I guess they should probably wear galoshes or something.
Thank you.
I mean, this is kind of gross, but the very first day on the job, when we went out on like a tour, and we do tours for various things, and I think it was a couple months into the job, and it was the first time I've ever actually been to a landfill, ever. And I step off of the tour bus, and I step on a dead cat.
Oh.
I have arrived. So, like I said, protection of human health and the environment. Obviously, if you're doing something that is an endangerment to the people working there, the people around your facility, or the environment directly, anybody in the DEQ has the authority to just say, you're done. You're not doing business today until we solve this problem. You cannot continue doing what you're doing until you fix this. That is like, that very rarely happens because most people don't want to lose a day's worth of revenue or however long it's going to it takes, so they kind of keep their ducks in a row. But what we'll do is I'll do a compliance assistance visit, which is a voluntary thing where they'll ask me to come out and take a look at a thing. And then our inspectors will come out and they'll actually look at it, and if you have a problem, they'll give you a letter of warning. Or if it's severe, or you've been warned about it before, they'll give you a notice of violation. And if you ignore the notice of violation, then they'll give you a follow-up letter, and if you ignore that, then they'll do some other things, and about 10 steps down the road, they give it to the lawyer down in the district attorney's office, and then they'll finally take it to court. But that almost never happens. So, most of the time, what we're dealing with is we're not going to try to fine you to make you do the right thing. We're going to try to get you back into compliance because that's how you should be operating. And on the rare occasion that something actually does go to court and something actually gets resolved and somebody actually pays a fine, we don't see a dime of it. I think it goes into a rotating fund for schools or something. So we don't have a motive to fine people because we don't get any of that money for our operations. We would rather just see you operate within the confines of the regulation and safely do your work without harming people or the environment. So obviously the rest of the rec is promote energy conservation. Don't throw so much stuff away, try to recycle it. Reduce waste that's being generated, promote the recycling. Proper waste management of that material. We classified them in 2 different categories. There's listed waste. Listed waste is a big, thick book that I have on my desk. F-listed wastes are like solvents, F001, I think, or one of those is acetone, I can't remember. It's a spent solvent. You already used it, it's got funky stuff in it, and you want to get rid of it. That's an F-listed waste. You have to dispose of it through a hazardous waste service provider. K-listed waste are byproducts, sludges, spill bottoms, all sorts of fun stuff like that from cleaning out the stuff that you use to make your product. U-listed waste are unused product. This is horrible, toxic, awful stuff that we use, but it's expired, or I just want to throw it away, or I don't know what to do with it anymore, and now I need to get rid of it. Well, once you decide to throw it away, it stops being a product and is now a generated waste, even though it's in the exact same container, and now you have to pay somebody to get rid of that. And then we have P-listed waste, which is lots of fun. That's U-listed waste. That's so dangerous that if you have more than 1 kilogram of it, you're in a big pile of problems because we have different generator status of businesses. If you're a large quantity generator, those are the guys that are producing the most waste. They're generally speaking producing over 1,000 kilograms in a month. If you have 1 kilogram of P-listed waste, you're automatically a large quantity generator because there's so much toxicity and danger to that chemical that you need to have all of the regulations over you to make sure you handle it correctly. An example, nicotine. There are so many pharmacies that we have had become a short-term large quantity generator because they had a bunch of Nicoderm patches that expired, and everything that patch has touched is also a waste. So the entire container, the patch, everything, the primary active ingredient is nicotine, which is a P-listed waste, so everything involved with it is a waste, and it doesn't take much of a shelf before you have over 1 kilogram, and now you're a large quantity generator. So don't order more than you need. A lot of stubborn faces.
We're obviously a large generator here at the Med Center.
You guys have been. You're always going to be. You can't get out of it.
My lab is a large quantity generator.
Yep. And actually, the interesting thing is, and it hasn't happened yet, and I'm really surprised, people are making their own vapor cigarette, they're vaping. They're making their own solutions. You can buy from a manufacturer pure concentrated nicotine to mix in, and it's just milligrams per kilogram of this stuff is what you actually need, and it's a vial of pure nicotine. Literally, if you spilled it on you, you would die. It is that much of a poison. You're using so little of it when you actually vape or have a cigarette, but if you put more than a couple drops on your skin, you better go to the emergency room because you might not make it. And I'm just waiting for somebody who's making vape fluid in their garage to spill it on their carpet, and now their entire house is P-listed waste. Not really. We make them cut the carpet out, but still, And I'm waiting. Just cross my fingers. Don't do it. Because it's the Wild West in vape cigarettes. There's a lot of people just doing whatever they want out of their basement. somebody's going to screw something up eventually, and I hope I'm not working today. Characteristic is the other category that we've got. These are not listed waste, but they're still dangerous. They're either ignitable, they're reactive, aka explosive, corrosive. They either have above 12.5 pH or below 2, I think, if that's correct. So really acid or really basic, that's corrosive waste. Toxic waste stuff, benzene, all sorts of things, as well as our recreate metals, the arsenic, barium, cadmium, chromium, lead, mercury, selenium, and silver. You got to test for all that kind of stuff, and most of that is in parts per billion. If you're over that amount, you have, doesn't matter how much material you got, you now have a whole bunch of hazardous waste. If you've got, well, that's why we're doing all the lead cleanup around town here. If you're over 5 parts per billion, or wait, it's 50 parts per billion of lead in soil, I think. But it's the toxic characteristic leaching procedure, or T-clip is what they're using, and they basically put that dry material into a solution and they see how much of that metal will leach out of it. The toxic characteristic leaching procedure. And if it's over that amount, then it is a hazardous waste. But you can do a total metals on dry material, and it usually is about 20 times as much. But once you actually leach it out, you'll find that you're below the limit. So if you get a lead amount that's over 100 on a total, you better rerun it to make sure it's not over 5 on a T-clip. Everybody got that?
Yeah. Are those metals, some of those seem pretty obscure. Am I just ignorant of how widely barium, cadmium, and selenium are used?
The thing is that a lot of these are naturally occurring. We do have to worry about sometimes, we're running this repeatedly with EPA, running into problems, especially in southern Kansas, where KDHE, which is the equivalent of Nebraska's DEQ, they'll say, well, you haven't remediated your area yet because you have too much arsenic. And you say, well, we didn't put any arsenic in the ground here, that's naturally occurring arsenic. Yes, but the regulation says you have to be below this level of arsenic. That's the arsenic that exists here naturally. Well, it's over the limit. You have to clean your water until it's down below that point. And it's just like the people butting heads against each other. Before I was at DEQ, I had to go down there to do some testing on some missile silos for the Army Corps. And that was the exact same problem. Like, well, we spilled some hydrazine out here 40 years ago. We need to test it. You realize that stuff evaporates over, like, instantaneously. It probably didn't even hit the ground. But I've still got to take a soil sample and mail it overnight to California to the only lab to test for it to get a negative result. And if it gets stuck in the mail, I've got to take another test. Because it has to be at the lab within 24 hours of sample. Even though we spilled it 40 years ago. I would think if it's going to go anywhere, it's already gone. But anyway.
I thought that now that you're on this subject, that this was precisely the reason why they originally thought they needed to keep landfills dry, so that they didn't have a big leachate pool of unknown acidic things and heavy metals. And
it is true that your average leachate is below 7. I think a lot of them are around the 4 and 5 pH area sometimes, depending on how much rain has been in that area lately. But they're not going to be so low that they're characteristically corrosive. And the leachate collection ponds themselves have just as rigid requirements for lining and impermeability as the landfill itself. So while it's evaporating liquid like water into the air, most of these materials are they're immobile. They're stuck in that solution. And so while it can concentrate over time, it's basically contained. And what we see happening a lot is actually this material, if they do find that they have to pump out the leachate pond and they have to take it somewhere because they've reached capacity, they do allow that to go through a water treatment plant in the same way that they would treat any of your sewage or anything else. And once it goes through all of those treatment process, usually by the time it gets out the other end, it will pass the T-clip and it will no longer have all of those metals or any of the, for example, that's why we always have to test if there's a gas spill, because it could be benzene is on the list. It's not a very high number that you can go and you'll be over for benzene. And even though you just have dirt with just a little bit of gasoline in it, suddenly you have a hazardous waste. So
the person that I talked to at the city's Department of Solid Waste had told me that they were worried about the concept of this gigantic battery at the bottom of your leachate pond acting as the electrolyte and the heavy metals contributing to.
The problem is that you have to actually have the two parts of the battery. The leachate would be a great solution, but unless you had the differing metals in either end of the pond, you probably wouldn't have that problem. Though I wouldn't put that past some people. I'm sure someone has figured out if I put this irrigation pipe on this side and this over here, I could do a really cool thing where I could jump start the compactor. But so far, I haven't heard of anybody pulling that off.
Yeah, so you're talking about all of these things and how they're restricted and monitored and tested for and all that, but yet we consistently dump things like 2,4-D on our grass and stuff like that.
Yep.
And so don't you find a little bit of something screwed up there?
It's kind of, I'll tell you what I tell people who call me. If you have a whole bunch of 2,4-D in your garage that you want to get rid of, it's still a product until you throw it away. So it's not my problem, and therefore not really your problem until you throw it away. If you can use it according to the instructions on the label, that is every single time, that will be less expensive than paying somebody to come out and take it away as a hazardous waste. A lot of your hazardous waste service providers, depending on what it is they're going to pick up and how much of it there is, it's going to be about $1,000 for them to just show up at your door. And that's before they ever weigh anything out or put on their Tyvek or do anything else. That is probably about base bottom for them to show up anymore. And they have an industry and they know what they're doing and they make a lot of money off of it because they know that the federal government is regulating that you have to do that. But if you're a small quantity or a conditionally exempt generator or a household, if you look at the total quantity of hazardous waste in Nebraska, and you look at how much of it is generated by the people who are exempt from disposing of it as hazardous waste, it's a much smaller quantity. And that quantity is being captured in the landfill, at least, so that we know where it's at and we know that it's being contained. It's not an ideal situation, but it would be impossible to have a governance in place to actually regulate every man, woman, and child in the state and everything that they do. And even though there's some people who think that's what we do, so. You, sir?
I see the selenium there, and I was in veterinary practice in Wisconsin for many years, and if our clients fed their dairy cattle the legal amount of selenium, we could guarantee them that they'd have selenium deficiencies, which led to reproductive and infectious problems. Now, I don't know if that's a problem here in Nebraska, but have you heard? I've been out of practice now for 30 years, so I don't know what's going on.
I'm not certain this is what you're talking about, but I know that there's a lot of additives that you can put in livestock feed. That the additive itself, if you tried to get rid of it, would be a waste because it would not pass a T-flip. But because it's a product and you're using it for its intended purpose, it's completely legal. And like you said, depending on where you are and what the actual intake of those animals is, that may not be enough for them. You know, we're talking about very, very rapid growth for example, a cow. They're putting on a lot of weight. They need a lot of material to grow with, and on some of them, you know, what's naturally occurring, they might have received over a 10-year lifespan, but they got to have it done in 18 months to get them out the door to the slaughterhouse. And they just don't have that material available to them.
Yeah, in Wisconsin and some of the other states in that area are selenium deficient, the soils.
We have almost the opposite here. I had a friend of mine I went to high school with, and I won't say where he lived, because what happened was he gave me a call before I was at DEQ, and he's like, "What is selenium?" I'm like, "What's the problem?" He's like, "They've shut down our well. They say we got too much selenium." And I don't know why. And it was in fact over the limits. They were over the residential drinking water standard for selenium at the city well. And until they drilled a new well, they actually had to activate some old wells that they hadn't used for a while to get different water. They were not allowed to pump water through their system because they had too much selenium in it. And you wouldn't think it, but I explained to them, like, if you've got an Olympic swimming pool with about 1 million gallons, you put in a thimbleful, and that's what puts you over. But selenium poisoning, your hair falls out, your skin turns gray, your fingernails fall off, but that has only ever really been seen on people who live on the slope of a heavy metals mine in China. They're getting exposure thousands of times over what our drinking water standard is. And I mean, it's in my shampoo, so you know, that's like a head and shoulders, it's got selenium in there.
Selenium is actually a micronutrient. You need a certain amount of it. And there's another place in China that has selenium poor soil so that people actually show selenium deficiency.
Can't win with it, can't win without it. Well, let's move on, because wow, you guys have lots of questions. We want to get to the cool stuff. Okay, so burn under barrier, subtitle C landfill. Subtitle C is one better than subtitle D. You have to have 2 impermeable barriers underneath it. You obviously don't crush the stuff out. You very carefully set your barrel in place. You very carefully bury it where it is, because that's a hazardous waste landfill. You do not want to breach your containment, and you do not want to have to test those double barriers that you have underneath it. But we do, there's one out in Colorado, I think there's one, and I think there's another one in Oklahoma. But it's basically stuff that you can't burn and is not radioactive. We gotta put it someplace, so they will bury it in the subtitle C landfill, different operating structure than a municipal solid waste. They don't want to breach their barrels, but
is that where you put the waste in the Love Canal, something like
that, well, the stuff that was in Love Canal probably should have gone to a subtitle C landfill instead of Love Canal. But we're going to get to the incineration part. We actually have one here in Nebraska. I don't know if you've ever been out to Chesney, which is the Clean Harbors Environmental Solutions Incorporated in Kimball, Nebraska. Extremely rigid air emissions on that. They are running an incinerator. The incinerator itself is like 6 stories tall, and then the stack goes up from there. I've had to go out there. That site takes about a week to inspect as a hazardous waste inspector, because you're going through a lot of stuff. There's a lot of buildings, and it still gets buried eventually anyway. This is Chesney. This is Clean Harbors. This is about 1 square mile, give or take. This is Highway 71. Just up here, a couple miles, is Interstate 80 in the city of Kimball, north of that. This is the main facility here. Most of this is long-term storage out here. This is their drainage pond. These are individual cells for their monofill. A monofill is just a fancy way of saying a landfill that only has one thing in it. So what they do is they have you can kind of see the tower here, where it's zoom in here. They have the stack. This is the whole facility. You basically barrels get ground up and sent over with all the contents. They save the metal, but all the material goes in. This thing has to burn at, I think it's 18 or 2400 Celsius. So it's a ridiculously high number. Everything in there is ceramic. It will eat metal. And it's like a levitating bed incinerator. It's just like, almost like clinker, or it looks like a cross between concrete nodules and cat litter, and it's all in this layer, and the heat actually suspends this stuff in a layer. And what they will do is they will purposely buy hazardous waste and the F-listed solvents or whatever. They burn real well, so they'll add that in as their fuel to burn something else that maybe doesn't have as high of an energy value. And then this stack is like the last stage. This stack is actually, there's so many scrubbers that material has to go through before it can exit the stack. It has to meet all of the emission standards, air emission standards, has no mercury and all this other stuff. And so what comes out of the back end of the incinerator is this, almost look like really rough, dusty ceramic beads of very small size. And that's what goes in their monofill. That's all that monofill is just the residuals from what came out of the incinerator.
NDEQ then is concerned. NDEQ is then concerned about air quality.
Yeah, we have an entire air quality section. A number of engineers. We have what we call a one-stop shop. We have new business wants to come into the state, they want to set up, they want to do their thing, and they will come and ask us, how many different permits do we need? And as we're going to break ground next week, and we want to be operational in a month, and we're going to be like, well, then you should have had your air permit into us about 18 months ago, because that's about how long it's going to take for you to get it done.
Then why do we allow this filth and junk to be put in the air the first week of July called fireworks?
Because we're using those products for their intended design.
It's hazardous chemical crap that goes into the air.
If I threw those fireworks away and I had to go and have them disposed of, then I'd have to have them disposed of as a hazardous waste, but they're being discharged for their intended purpose, so they're not a waste.
It's still hazardous crap going into the air.
It's also loud and obnoxious. I get the same phone call every couple of weeks during football season as well, because they're trying to convince me that the balloons that get released after touchdown are a waste being disposed of. And I'm like, no, they're balloons. They're being used for their intended purpose.
To my understanding, fireworks and rocket fuel have a waste product called perchlorate.
They can, yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, that's killed a lot of the groundwater in Southern California.
Sure. I'm not personally familiar with it, but yeah, I would not doubt it at all. If you ever want to see some cool videos, go on YouTube and look for fireworks factory explosions. Because there's a lot of potential energy there. Usually they're out in the middle of a desert, in the middle of a valley someplace where nobody else lives, and probably nobody else will for quite some time. Because when they pop, they can go big. But yeah, perchlorate is all sorts of stuff. Obviously, the different colors of the fireworks also are the different metals. Some of the metals that were on my T-clip list there, the Recreate metals, they're actually in the firework, and they'll give you the different colors of fire or sparkles or whatever. But it's the same way as if you're going to a firing range. If you're firing lead bullets into an earthen mound, I'm not depositing lead waste, I'm using bullets for their intended purpose. When I'm done with the firing range and I'm going to sell that piece of property, then I have to clean it up as a hazardous waste, but not until then. So let's keep trucking here, because we're almost out of time already. We even got to the good stuff. So waste facilities, like I said, conditionally exempt is less than 100 kilograms in a month. Small quantity is 100 to 1,000. That's one of the biggest categories there. That's the most businesses that get inspected. There's a couple thousand of those in the state at any given time. Large quantities over 1,000 kilograms a month. I think we have 70 that are active year to year in the state of Nebraska, but they still produce the lion's share of hazardous waste in the state, even though there's not that many of them. We will inspect all of these guys. SQGs and LQGs, we're actually doing that with EPA most of the time. The states lately more so, because EPA is getting their funding cut, are getting kind of a hands-off by EPA. You guys have your own hazardous waste program. We will come and help supplement that, and our own inspectors will do inspections in your state, but you're responsible for the lion's share of that. You're also responsible for the lion's share of the enforcement of that. Unless you live in Iowa, who said, we don't care, you guys do it. So EPA does the hazardous waste in Iowa. They're one of like 2 states, I think, that does that. So we get a chunk of money every year from the federal government to run our hazardous waste inspection program, and that way they don't have to. I guess essentially what it comes down to. Let's do this.
One right here, big tornado, and one over here.
Huge stovepipe. Oh my God, amazing. Oh my God, I can't believe this.
This was the best one I could find on YouTube, actually. That didn't have a bunch of guys running around going, woo! That's all.
We got one on the left. Oh no, it's getting this down. Filter's right here.
Generating a lot of solid waste out of
We're gonna get into that.
Oh, I just hit something. Oh, it's flying debris, look!
Oh, wow.
No, 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 no!
What?
No, don't hit the town! No! Listen to the roar! Oh my God!
Oh, my goodness.
What is that car doing?
God.
Where's that?
No, no, no!
He's rolling towards it.
No! God, no, no. Please! I hope you're taking shelter. Please be taking shelter. Oh, no.
So that's Pilger. June 16th, 2014. I was there doing my little inspection. The DEQ mobilized in a big way after that event. We were all out there providing compliance assistance, hazardous and solid waste monitoring, everything else we could think of. Literally half the town was just obliterated. I mean, did anybody else go out to inspect or volunteer for cleanup?
I just drove through.
It was a nightmare. The total, there was actually 4 funnel clouds on the ground. The one that hit Pilger dead center as it hit was a Fujita scale 4. They call it the enhanced Fujita scale because they figured out by wind speed they would calculate how bad it would be if it had actually hit something. But in this case it did. We actually had 4 of them come through here. The main one obviously that we saw in video, and then the other one that they were saying off to the left of it. This one came up through here and obliterated a chicken farm and some other stuff, and then there was another one off of this side. I spent a couple days actually driving around in the country visiting every single farm along these routes, making sure that everybody knew what they needed to do as far as disposing of their solid and hazardous waste. Mostly just entire farmyards just gone. So yeah, this is a picture I took. This is one place, thank God there was nobody injured at this site, but there was literally just mattresses and shingles on the ground, and that was it. There was nothing left. I am surprised that there was that much damage, but then again, seeing all the trees that were around it, I'm surprised that the combine was still there at all after this was done. This is our film person was off over here looking, and this is the north side of town. It came right through the middle here. This building up here by 2, this is the Pilger transfer station. For whatever reason, it was completely untouched. The funnel cloud came right along the side of it. And then this area that you see, this green area, this field was converted into a temporary disposal site. This is the middle school, I believe. We'll zoom in here. This is a shot from closer up. This building's gone now. Most of this stuff is gone. As you can see, when it came through the middle of town, this was most of the business district that ran through here. Tornadoes are weird. They took all of the silos, but they left the corn. Just huge 50-foot high piles of corn, and it just looks like you took the whole thing, just went and lifted it, and it's gone. Found debris from miles away. All sorts of fun stuff. I actually had to go in with one of the city planners. This front, you come in the front and it just looks like a school. And you're like, okay, this is fine. And then you go up the stairs and this is looking out. That's the second floor. If you're this door right here looking out this way, that's what we had to deal with. And then you can see just like 2 blocks away, some of these houses are fine. And the town they're bouncing back. They are rebuilding. I do believe that they bus all the kids over to Wakefield now. But they were only bringing some of them here anyway. They're a conglomerate school district. This was a part of the pile that was produced. This is the main pile here. This was just building debris. This is right in front of the transfer station. As you see, heavy equipment, they were separating out. We did have lots of just mostly metal pile, mostly concrete pile. All of this material, we basically were operating under natural disaster declaration, so we were able to dispose of this as easily as possible. Probably should have gone to a municipal solid waste landfill because you couldn't be certain of what all was in there, but because we just wanted to get this stuff taken care of, and the majority of this material was what we would consider to be construction and demolition waste, so we did allow most of that to go to a C&D landfill. Something else to consider though is your house is not just your house. There is a lot of other stuff in your house, and I don't know if you can see this. This is like, these are gas canisters, these are aerosol cans, this is bug spray, anything you can think of. This is just a small convenience store in town. This was their security camera. The very beginning, you can see somebody has got a flashlight over here. They're getting down into a basement, and about 40 seconds later this happens. When it hit town, it was about 4 p.m., so that's why there's a lot of good footage, is because the light was perfect and it was very well illuminated. And this is supposed to be a nighttime camera, but as soon as the roof is gone, it's got enough light so it switches over to being a color camera at that point. And so as you can imagine, everything in there was a household product, would technically be a household hazardous waste, but it never made it to a household. Now it's just a hazardous waste, and we got to figure out what to do with all these containers, all these aerosol cans, all of these cans of fuel, everything you could think of. You got to get rid of it, and that's exactly what happened. Is we told these people, as you're cleaning this stuff up, if you don't know what it is, make the button work. There we go. This is inside the transfer station. This is just a very small amount of the actual material that was found. This is all fuel additives, antifreeze, oil, aerosol cans, you name it, pesticides, herbicides, anything that they picked up anywhere. If it had a label or you didn't know what it was, you had to send it to the transfer station because they didn't want it in the C&D bottle. We eventually classified all this as household hazardous waste because of the natural disaster protocol that was in play. We didn't want to make it harder than it already was. But we had a couple 100 gallons of latex paint. How many of you have grills at home? Imagine what would happen in your neighborhood if everybody's grill blew up. Thousands of these all over town. Hopefully, well, they're pretty well intact. Most of them still had fuel in them. We didn't have any explosions that we know of. But yeah, and there's no way to tell. Whose is this? No idea. We got to figure out someplace for it to go. So all of this had to be disposed of as hazardous waste. Taken to, I think actually these were salvaged for the most part. They're worth more for the metal than what's in them. So they were being off-gassed and then salvaged in that manner just to get them out of there and make sure that they weren't in danger to anybody. This was I stole this personally from the Tuscaloosa News and then got the permission to use it. And then the EPA is coming to ask me about it. I'm like, no, you got to talk to Tuscaloosa because this ain't my deal. But this is, and this was difficult because in the first couple days, you couldn't tell where the street was. They had to clear those first before you could actually know where your curb was to set all your stuff. It was pretty frantic. There was a time there where they were asking if they could get an emergency permit to just take a C&D site right there on the property and just bury it where it was. And the only reason they didn't do that is because FEMA wouldn't pay for it. So they did actually have to pay to get it trucked off to one of the other landfills in the county. So Pilgers Clean and Rebuilding, all solid waste is now off-site. Nice clean green field there again in the building. The community is rebuilding itself. All the hazardous waste is recovered and declared to be household hazardous waste, so it was easier to dispose of in that regard. And that way it was exempted from heavy regulation, but it was still properly disposed of. And man, we went through a whole bunch of time. I was worried I wouldn't have enough slides, right? I even had extra stuff in case I needed to. So hi, I'm Eric. I'm the professional geologist for DEQ. Questions, comments, short stories? Title 132 is management of your landfills, basically, and all of this is rooted in the Code of Federal Regulations, 40 CFR, which is a magnificent sleep aid. Let me tell you, it's about this thick. It sits on my desk and holds up one of my computer monitors.
You've been very great on the information about chemical. To steal an old Olivia Newton-John song titled, what about physical radioactive waste? Do we have to deal with that?
Not my problem! Actually, radioactive waste is actually under the regulation of the Department of Health and Human Services. They do have a RAD program, and depending on what exactly you're dealing with, if it's really weird, they will bump it up to the Department of, not NRD, it's an energy, Nuclear Regulatory Energy Commission, is that it? But it immediately jumps right up to the Fed level. The same way that in all of this, I've never mentioned PCBs. We don't touch it. It goes straight to EPA. They have their own regulations in play for that. Thankfully, nobody uses them much anymore, but we still every once in a while get an old transformer with PCB oil in the transformer, and we basically are like, hands off, it's not my problem. I mean, I know you guys want to get rid of this the quickest, easiest way possible, but you need to call Kansas City, because that's the closest. Region 7 is the office that covers Nebraska, like Kansas City, and you'll have to come up and take a look at it. Stu?
I live right around the corner from Heflinger Park.
Okay.
Old landfill. I think it was active into the mid-70s.
Yeah, old landfills are great for like golf courses. They're amazing.
Yeah, we're at least judging by the newspaper about it. Anyway, they're using the dog park now. A couple of years ago, one of the local stations had some story, and they had some e-tag like that. Now it's maybe gas escaping from this landfill, it's dangerous, and everybody, the dog park was like, anything to that, or is that just sensational?
The older your landfill is, the less gas is going to be coming out of it. And like I said, you get old enough, and there's just not enough putrescible waste in there to make any more gas. That's why we have that 30-year timeline for post-closure. Even though that thing is completely sealed with a layer below and a layer above and everything else, it should still be completely decomposed by 30 years, maybe. We're having a lot of dry landfill issues where we're talking about not recirculating that leachate. We've got some people worried that they may go beyond 30 years because it won't be a completely stabilized mound at that point. But for the most part, your old landfills, like I believe that one was closed before 93, wasn't it? Yeah, so it has been washed through completely. If there's anything out there, I would be surprised, and if there is anything detectable, it's not going to be dangerous.
Okay, well, we are going to continue the conversation over at Max and Joe's at Crescent Moon. Anybody wants to join us there? We have a place reserved. We're going to have some food and beverages if you want. So,
See, I just threw these in here just in case.
tell us
you know,
about them.
This is, I get calls from people to go, I found a thing, I need to get rid of it. These are fire grenades that a woman had up in her attic. The contractor that was supposed to be insulating her attic said, I don't know what the hell they are, I'm not going to touch it until you guys come and do something about it. These are actually filled with a fluid solution of carbon tetrachloride that when it heats up and gasifies, it completely displaces all of the oxygen, but the chemicals involved also physically interrupt the combustion process, which is an interesting side effect. They originally didn't know it did that. They just thought it would push all the air out of the way. But unfortunately, if you're going to use those, you do it in a room that you're not standing in, because then you will pass out and die. And then if you notice, a lot of them have these they often had a little spring that was held in place by a low temperature solder. And so if it got hot enough, it would melt the solder and the spring would automatically shoot out and pop the globe and release the fluid, which is what this is. This is actually, it was sitting in the top of one of these, and these little holes were supposed to spread it out over the fire. And she had 4 of them up in her attic, and basically she got whoever built the house got a discount on their fire insurance by installing these back in the 50s. And they still made these up until 1980. That's another one. Hi, I'm a doctor. My dad was a doctor, and he labeled everything religiously. So if that's what it says, that's what it is. No, I don't know where he got it. No, I don't know why he had it. Please come and get it. I was doing back-end little calculations on this. I think this is a pint jar. And I was trying to figure out how many square blocks we have to evacuate if that vaporized. We got the EPA to show up within an hour to pick that one up. They were like, "No, we're not doing any paperwork. That's gone." This is the last one earlier this year. Does anybody know what that is?
You told me what it is.
Yeah, that's a 12-ounce Miller High Life bottle completely full of mercury. That weighs about 8 pounds, give or take. I figured this out. It's 1 gallon of mercury is like 55 pounds and some change. Anyway, yeah, apparently his brother was a gold miner and wanted to use this to make gold mining in Alaska. And don't know why, they wouldn't let him on the plane with it. So he's been sitting in his garage for a couple of decades because
what else you gonna do with it, right?
yeah, and my brother was dead. He's like, I don't know what the hell to do with it, and I'm selling the house. Come get it. And we passed something not so long ago called the Mercury Export Ban Act, which was we used to have a market for mercury. We were sending a lot of it overseas. The problem was the people who were buying it were China, India, all these Southeast Asian countries, and they were using it for that gold amalgam mining. Basically, they put a little bit of that mercury in with their gold pan, and they would amalgamize it with the gold, and then they could pull it out. But you just dump ridiculous amounts of mercury directly into whatever stream you happen to be on the side of the hill with your mine. And so we put in the MEBA, Mercury Export Ban Act, to prevent that from happening. The problem is that we already have a whole bunch of mercury in our light bulbs, or fluorescent light bulbs, even the low mercury ones still have a little bit in them. We also have natural production of mercury because we have our own precious metals mining, and that's just a byproduct of naturally occurring mercury. And so we have about 300 tons a year that we have no market for. We have nothing to do with it, and we can't export it. So the price to dispose of mercury rather than recycle it has gone through the roof as a result of this. And I'm having problems finding a way to get rid of it. Because they're like, oh, well, we got a grant from you guys to get rid of all this household hazardous waste, but we don't want any mercury. And I'm like, well, I gave you money, you're going to take the mercury. But yeah, so we get stuff like that every once in a while. And then for every one of these, I've got 2 or 3 people who are yelling at me for 50 minutes because I'm letting them spray chemtrails. So, but that's all I got.